Right, good afternoon everyone. I am so delighted to see so many faces for this talk and all the interest in it. I'm thrilled. And thank you to John Arbon for asking me. My name's Sinead, I'm the dyer behind Gullrock Fibres and I'm based in Plymouth. Well, it's a bit of a lofty title, but really natural dyeing is that perfect mashup between art and science and that real excitement of discovering things. What my aim is today is to help you access good resources, provide you with lots of tips if you're just getting started. I'm going to give you a general overview on natural dyes if you're not familiar with them, 4 scientific ideas to help you understand what's going on and to troubleshoot, some processing tips, some energy saving advice, and then we'll look at some pretty colours. So you may have come across natural dyeing in articles which encourage use of kitchen scraps, and while I'm definitely up for using some of those under certain circumstances, as textile creators, what we really want to be using are dyestuffs that stand the test of time. Now, perhaps not the 4,000 years that these linen scraps have held their colour, but at least for the lifetime of the garment or tapestry or whatever it is that we're dyeing for. These were dyed with a scale insect called Kermes vermilio, and they were found in 2016 in the Cave of Skulls in the Judean desert. So now, where are we all at then? Whenever I start, whenever I start a new interest, I always think of the Dunning-Kruger curve. So 8 years ago, this is me, dancing through the fields like some sort of deranged earth fairy, collecting no plant is safe from my dye pots. And while this stage is essential for fostering enthusiasm and energy and experimentation, eventually you'll come across some pitfalls, so things will start to go wrong. So you'll get a lovely colour that doesn't last, or you'll buy a dye stuff in good faith and perhaps it's not light fast, or you'll get crocking or rub off and you're not sure why, it's never happened before, or you can't recreate a colour. And so you end up down in the valley of despair. Now, I'm at the stage where I'm sort of gradually climbing up the slope of enlightenment with some good resources, some information from Guild, great books, great courses. And that's partly what I want to share with you today, so you know where to go. Because I found that quite difficult 8 years ago to find resources. It's getting better because the resurgence in interest. So where's everyone else? Anybody? Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, so really at the start, anybody done a bit of feeling quite chipper about it? No? Okay. Anybody done? Yeah, exactly. Anybody done a bit and going, oh, what's going on now? No, okay. So as I said, I'm sort of making my way up there. Right. I also, when I start a new interest, I liked some context. And that you know when you start getting interested in something, you start seeing it everywhere. So this is my local National Trust property. So you look up at the tapestries and they've got that bluish tinge because they were dyed with a yellow natural dye stuff, an indigo, and of course the yellow natural dye stuff has faded. So you were left with sort of blue grass and blue sky, bluegrass even. Also, things like I've got really interested in the social geography and history of natural dyes, and there's a ton of really good books tracing the history and the trade routes of those. Start to get interested in horticulture, grew my own dye garden, like going to see other people's more than I like growing my own. And then you start to see there's lots of museums around that specialise in natural dyes and conservation. It's all out there. It's just trying to find it. At the moment, I'm doing a course on the chemistry of natural dyes, hence trying to give you some information about this as well. And if you see the reenactment scene has a lot of really, proficient dyers. So we've got this chap in Finland, and his tunic has been dyed with nettle with a bit of copper, and his pantaloons with madder root. And I don't know what his hat is, but it's looking fairly dapper. And they're sticklers, for getting it right. So what can we dye with? Well, we can dye with plants, all sorts of plants, all sorts of bits of plants. Now, it doesn't mean that every single part of the plant is going to give you good dye colour. And a tip for looking for good dye plants would be the addition of tinctoria to the Latin name of the plant, which tells you it's going to give you dye. But they don't all have that, and you can try things. You can dye with animals. So you can dye with scale insects, which give you incredible colour. And they used to dye with mollusks to get purple. You can get enormous colour range out of fungi. And lichens, so think dyeing Scottish kilts. They're all done with lichens. Algae has been used to print on clothing, algae dyes. And finally, the fashion industry are growing bacteria to dye onto material. So there's an awful lot going on, quite small scale, but lots of different dye stuffs. So if we take a common dye stuff like madder root, how are you going to get it? So we've got the dye stuffs could come to you, or you could dig it up whole or chopped up, usually dried. They can come as ground powders, so you can buy them as ground powders. This isn't so great for wool, because if you imagine trying to rinse it out, the little powders, it's fine, but it does come out. And you might buy them as extracts. Now, extracts have been processed through a lab, so they produce really, really fine powders, extremely concentrated, expensive, use sparingly, but give great colour. So now, scientists love to group things. So the different dye families contain different phytochemicals, just means plant chemicals, and you might have come across these in foodstuffs as well if you're a nutritionist. Enormous family called the flavonoids, which have several subfamilies. I just want to mention the anthocyanins. This is the family that look like they should give brilliant colour, so things like berries, flower petals, red cabbage, all of those sorts of things. Unfortunately, they're fugitive, so that colour will go very quickly. It doesn't mean that you can't use, say, red cabbage in a school science experiment to show changes of colour with acidity. It's fantastic for that. It's not good for our textiles, though. Some dye stuffs belong to more than one family, so something like weld or pomegranate skin would belong to both of those families. And one of the reasons why the dye stuffs are so multidimensional is that they release different phytochemicals at different times in the process and different temperatures. So you get these complex colours, and they're not flat like synthetics. So some groups contain what we call adjective dyes, which you may have come across, that don't require what we call a mordant to help them stick to the material. So things like cutch, black walnut, things like that, you don't have to use a mordant with. Cochineal, you don't have to. Things like madder and onion skins, you don't have to, but it will improve your colour and light fastness if you do, if you mordant the fibres. and that most dyes, however, are substantive in that they require a mordant to attach them to the fibre. Okay, so you've got a two-step process. And finally, most of those dyes that we've in those families form chemical bonds, but there's a family called the indigoids, which are vat dyes, and you will need, then they're insoluble in water. So you will need to reduce them, take out the oxygen using a vat, and they end up physically attached to the material, not chemically bonded. So they're a bit different, that family. Okay, right. Oh, this is the bossy bit. So, okay, there's lots of scope for making some risky errors in your practice, especially at the beginning. We see lots of farmers, engineers, dyers develop health issues later in life because they've exposed themselves over time to chemicals. So you need to be aware of what you're handling and just take some sensible precautions. Remember as well that natural dyeing is a completely unregulated process at the moment. So there isn't that framework like there would be in the food industry or wherever, where you're supposed to, know the safety rules. Okay, so, and the fact that we're dealing with natural dyes doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to be safe or healthy for you. So one of the things you need to consider is what space you're going to use. Now, preferably something other than your kitchen, and this is highly hypocritical because that's where most dyers start, including me. But definitely try and find a bit of your kitchen away from the food prep area. Make sure that all of your utensils are labelled dye stuffs and you're not using anything for your food prep. You are essentially setting up a small lab. So with my teaching background, you should know, you should have a risk assessment. I know overused, but you should have a risk assessment for all the chemicals that you're using, and some idea about how you're going to mitigate any risk. So thinking about things like, there's no way that I would invite a student in school to stick their hand in a pot of something that's like pH 11, highly alkaline. And yet you see dyer after dyer showing, their blue hands and stuff. So be aware of what's in your pot. So glove up. With the mordants that we use, they produce a weak sulfuric acid. And you see a lot of people handling mordanted wool and sticking their hands in dye pots. So it is a mild acid. We do know that things like that pass through the blood-brain barrier. So gloves, just gloves. Easy solution. If you're using extracts, remember that inhaling fine particles not good for your lungs. So if you're speckle dyeing something, just get yourself a mask for that bit. You don't have to wear it all the time. Make sure you're in a well-ventilated area. A lot of people like to dye outside if they can. You need to have, we'll talk more about kit in a minute, but you need to have a pot that's got a good fitting lid. What you don't want is your fumes, coming up and spreading in your house. You don't want to be constantly lifting the lids, inhaling, all of that. Okay. This is a Sinead special. Getting ready for a show. I don't do that, but I use induction heaters, and you've got 3 or 4 of them on the go, 3.5 kilowatts, drawing loads of current, and there goes your ring main. So just be aware of how you're using those. And finally, plant ID is critical. So things like, somebody will say, go and dye with some fern tops. So make sure you're picking ferns rather than bracken ferns, which are carcinogenic. Make sure with the Umbellifer family, they've got wonderful dye stuffs like cow parsley and fennel, but they've also got the highly toxic hemlock. So your leaf ID is really important here, okay? And etiquette. So in our excitement at wanting to gather all these plants, you'll start seeing them everywhere. You have to remember just a few rules. So hedgerows are excellent sources of dye materials, but just remember that the farmers are under fairly strict instructions of when they can cut their hedges. So you coming in and stripping things is not going to go down well. So you need to harvest responsibly, right time of year and with permission. Local parks and gardens are brilliant sources of tannins, so especially after storms, you get lots of windfalls. Again, ask, don't pick off the tree. It's obvious stuff, isn't it? Plants like weld and goldenrod often grow on waste ground, and they're usually on a motorway as you're passing by at 70 miles an hour, and you're like, I don't want that. But again, just ask. And a lot of municipal car parks are amazing sources of staghorn sumac for your talus. Seriously, B&Q. So, and again, go and ask. There's tons of it, but just go and ask. Also, with lots of pollinators, you can still get excellent colour after the flowers have gone over a bit. Things like goldenrod, buddleia. The colour's still great, but you know, let the bees have a bit first. And again, permission from the landowner if you're picking. And this is your intrepid dyer having rescued a load of weld from the strimmers down the road. So you start to spot it everywhere. Okay, so what are we going to dye on? So you can either dye on animal fibres or plant fibres. Animal fibres are known as protein fibres. Plant fibres are known as cellulose fibres. Okay. Now, we are going to look at keratin-based fibres today because we're in a mill, because we're all wool obsessives, and because they're the easiest materials to get good results on. Okay. So we could look at sheep, goats, bunnies, alpaca. We're going to look at sheep today, but you could also dye onto silk, and there is a multitude of cellulose fibres like cotton and flax, and that you can also dye onto, more challenging to get good results. Okay, right, so wool, we love wool. Wool fibres are unique. It is the miracle material. So a wool fibre is made up of cortex inside it with randomly arranged cells. And this is surrounded by a waterproof layer of overlapping scales. Okay. And when you put wool into water, it will swell up and those scales will open up, and that will allow mordant and dye particles to get past the scales into the cortex where they've got loads of room to bond and be, and then they're in, and that's what we're aiming for. Different wools have got different characteristics because these are all different sizes, thickness, shapes. So something like, she says looking, something like Tavonia with its long wool mix will take the dye very well. It will give it's got luster from the worsted spin on it, and I'm sure you know from picking up all the different blends out there that they do take the dye quite differently. Okay, so if you've got coarser wools, they've got a bit in the cortex that won't accept dye. So if you're dyeing with maybe, just trying to think, maybe a down wool or something like that, which is a bit coarser, you won't get that super saturated colour as much. It won't hold it in the middle of the cortex. Okay, now with each of those fibres, we've got these long chain amino acids. Okay, and they've got strong bonds between them that are responsible for the tensile strength and the crimp. So spinners would be interested in that, but as dyers we don't care. But we are interested in these sort of these ionic weak iron pair links which are charged, which we'll come to in a minute. So the charged part of those weak links will be important. Okay, so what are we trying to achieve? Well, we want good colour that stays put. Okay, so we've got to conjure up some kind of magic trick here, because we've got to get the dye stuffs, we've got some sweet chestnut there, the dye stuffs to dissolve in the water to form a solution. But then what we want is for it to stick to the yarn, and then we want it to be in the yarn and be insoluble. Okay, so something's got to happen between there. And the insoluble dye stuff, once it's in the yarn, is known as a lake. So you might hear about lake pigments, things like that. Okay, right, we've got 3 main parts of the process. They're all really important for successful dyeing. So scouring is giving something a really good wash, obviously, mordanting, a bit more in a minute, and then we get to dye. Okay, before we do that, it's helpful to have an appreciation of pH. So this is arguably probably the most important tool in the dyer's armoury, I'd say, when you're understanding what's going on with different dye stuffs. So it's essentially how many hydrogen ions are in a solution. If there are more, you have an acidic solution. If there are less, you have an alkaline solution. Okay, and these are numbered. And if we have a look here, we can already see things like we've got lemon, fruit acids, things like ammonia. Where is it? Ammonia. These are all things that we can use in dyeing to modify, to change colours. And so we need to understand what pH we've got in our dye pot. If you take something like coffee, which is mildly acidic, and at pH 5, bear in mind that this isn't a linear scale, so it's not twice as acidic as stomach tablets. It's 10, 100,000, 10,000, 100,000 times. So this is a log scale along here. Okay. So if you want to test for pH, the cheapest, easiest way is to use universal indicator paper, which is this stuff. And really easy, you just dip it in your solution, it'll turn a colour, and then you compare it to your chart and figure out which pH you're at. And if you're aiming for something more acidic, then you're going to have to add whatever your acid of choice is to shift it. Okay. But why do we care? Why do we care? So if we take some lovely Devon Naturals, either yarn or fibre, and we wet it, the wool immediately becomes weaker because we've wet it. A pH of around 5 is where wool is most comfortable. It's happiest around there. And wool won't tolerate alkaline conditions or strongly acidic conditions. It will just break bonds and it will get brittle. Cotton's a little bit more tolerant, so you can mess around a bit more with that. And also different dye stuffs have also got preferences. So some of them really like to be in an acidic environment. And if we take something like madder root, it's a complete joy for the dyer because you can get oranges, reds through to purples with madder root, but you've got to manage it carefully when you're shifting it towards the alkaline end, because making wool alkaline and applying heat to it is not a good combination. So it will become brittle. But there are ways of doing it. You can do it cold. I've just done a course on madder dyeing that showed us some methods to do that. And lastly, what's your water like? So your water can really affect your outcomes. So that's your allowed range of pH with your water. Some of you might have, or like around here, it's pretty soft water, isn't it? Yeah, and Plymouth's not too bad either. But if you've got lots of iron in your water, you might find that your colours are getting saddened. And if you're interested, you can print off your water report and see what your water contains. Okay, so that's pH. Now, you also have to understand a little bit about forces. So we are relying, with dyeing, we're relying on electrostatic forces to make it work. And if we've got charged particles, if you've got positively charged particles, two positively charged particles, they will repel each other when they come near each other. Similarly, with two negatively charged particles, they will repel each other. So opposite charges, positive and negative, they will attract each other, and that's mostly what we're interested in dyeing, is we're looking for these attractive forces to try and make things stick together. If you're not so familiar with charges, a lot of people relate to the laws of magnetism. So you've got unlike poles attracting, unlike poles repelling. Okay. All right. Now, if we want to understand mordants, she says hunting. Right, I'm going to be talking mostly about alum mordant, which is a crystalline substance. Okay. So, does anyone remember this from school, or am I totally, some nods? Yay. Okay. All right. So this is sodium chloride, which is table salt. Can I just say at this point, do not use table salt for a mordant. It won't work. It hasn't got the pulling power. But it's always the example given. So mordants are metal salts, and what we end up with, they transfer an electron from the metal to the chlorine atom, and that leaves the sodium atom with one less electron, so it's a little bit less negative or a bit more positive. And this one, the chlorine, is a little bit more negative because it's gained an electron. So what we've got are two ions, we've ionized it. And what ends up happening is that we've got the positive and negative ions, and they like each other, they're attracted, and they form a crystalline structure. So imagine this would be a lump of crystal, this alum, and they just bash it up, okay? And so it's got lots of little crystals in there. All right. Last one. You're doing really well. So the last one is coloring conjugation. Now, natural dyes give off colour because they've got alternating double and single bonds. We call this conjugation, okay, in varying different combinations, I suppose. And the positioning of those double and single bonds, the alternating bonds, determines what wavelength is given off, which determines what colour you see. So if you start messing around with the pH, you're going to change the format of the double and single bonds, changing the wavelength, which changes the colour. Or if you lob something like bleach at it, you're going to destroy the conjugation, the alternating double and single bonds, and then the colour goes, it disappears. You've just got a white blob. Okay, so that's important. All right, back to our process. Okay, set up. Is everyone okay? Yeah. I told you I was going to chuck some info. Right. I started off with some just sort of cheapy saucepans to do samples with, which is fine. But once you start doing larger quantities, it would be good to have a higher quality pot with a decent base on it, because again, do you remember I was saying you don't want to be going like this all the time? Obviously you want to move your yarn around. You don't want hot spots, so a cheap saucepan will have hot spots and it will rust quickly, neither of which you want. So these are great. So I know that I can leave yarn in them and not risk having little, you know, burnt bits on those. What else? So you don't need that many pots. It would be good if you had a mordanting pot and a dyeing pot. That would be good. I use an induction heater because I'm dyeing inside. I don't really want gas bottles and things, but I do like a gas heater because it's really easy to alter the temperature. I've got to know these though. I know how quickly they heat up and what I need to be doing with those. Thermometer. You're keeping an eye on temperature. Different dye stuffs like different temperatures. These are really useful. She says hunting. Reusable cable ties, really good. Okay, so for lifting your skeins out and trying not to get them tangled. Okay, we said your pH paper, your universal indicator paper. I would use plastic sieves because the metal ones will get rusty quite easily, and you don't want rust marks on your precious wool. Stainless steel tongs. What else? And the little jeweler scales are great for giving you really precise measurements for your maybe your extracts and for your alum. Okay, and we said cable ties. Little doggy bowls, great for sampling, cheap and cheerful. They work really well. Sieves, and I've got the world's smallest muslin bag here, but if you don't want to be picking out loads of dye stuffs from your wool, you could put something like your madder root into one of those and have it in the solution. And then you need somewhere where you can rinse everything, and you tend to be back in your kitchen, unfortunately. Okay, right. Scouring. You've got to do it for your... It's the only time where you cannot get away without using heat in this process, okay? Because you are trying to melt spinning oil. You're trying to melt lanolin. And if you don't do this, you're never going to get your mordant and your dye particles to stick to your yarn. You'll get some of them to stick to it, but not all of them. Okay. I'm just going to pass around. So this is what I get off the cone from John Arbon, which is just some apple door, which has still got its spinning oil in. Now, John Arbon is saying to people to wash their yarn to get it to plump up before they knit it. And you can see this is washed and mordanted, and you can just see the difference.
It's the same.
It's the same yarn, but you can see the difference that it's made to it. You'll need a pH neutral detergent. Don't use a soap. Remember that soap's alkaline, wool doesn't like alkalinity. So pH neutral detergent. And the action of the detergent is just to surround all the oil molecules and just segregate them almost, and then wash them away. Just a few tips. When you start this process, you've got to wet your wool out. And if I haven't got one here, but let's take something like this that's 400 meters of yarn. What you don't want is an almighty tangle in your pot. So you'll need to do loose figure 8 ties around, if you're a spinner, you'll be used to this anyway, around your skein. And it will save you time later. Loose because when the wool puffs up, you don't want those ties squeezing it so that when you dye it, you're going to get a resist mark on it. You've got to wet your yarn out thoroughly. So usually I mean, this is all an exercise in patience, but if you put your yarn in water and just let it sink down slowly, just go away for half an hour and it'll sink down slowly, and then you know once it's all submerged that it's wetted out. You don't want the middle of your yarn to be dry. The dye stuff's got to penetrate through those scales. So try to resist the urge to go and then try and squeeze the water out like we all do. Okay, so mix your detergent in with your water. Add the skeins. I tend to have tepid water. I try not to shock my wool in any way, just into the tepid water. You're heating water to a simmer and then hold it there for an hour. And then what I would try and do, I don't want to be hauling wool out of really hot water, and I don't want to be agitating the wool in case it felts. But I don't want it to go so cold that all my good work with the lanolin and the spinning oil has been wasted. So I would try and get it out when it's maybe around 50 degrees and just into similar temperature water, perhaps. The water, if you scour properly, will be filthy. If it's proper wool, unprocessed wool, so you'll know how much stuff was in there.
Can I just ask what you use as your detergent?
I use that Orvis paste, which they use to get things like grass stains out of horses' manes and things. It's just, but it's quite gentle. You could do a detergent. No, you could. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, you're just trying to avoid really alkaline soaps, really. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, very liquid. Yeah. And just, I would avoid all the bubble issues, but yeah. No, for sure. So before we talk about Mordanting, just a little bit more about water. So it's a really special molecule. It's because of the way the electrons are arranged in water, this oxygen atom is a bit more negative than the hydrogens. And this makes it what we call a polar molecule. Okay, so this end's a bit negative, this end's a bit positive. And it means that we can dissolve, that it can dissolve polar molecules. So we can dissolve dyestuffs in it. That's why it's important to us. It's also a slightly strange shape because these spare electrons have forced these hydrogen atoms into this. Instead of being a horizontal arrangement, they've gone, because they don't like each other, they're both negative, they've gone, we don't like each other, and they push those hydrogen legs down, if you like. These are covalent bonds here. All right, so you imagine your water. Now, we've got lots of water molecules here. Okay, H2O, H2O, H2O. And what they can do is form what we call hydrogen bonds between them. And sometimes these hydrogens jump ship. And so if a hydrogen jumps ship, it forms another kind of ion. Now, if you remember with the sodium chloride, ions are charged particles. All right. And if we imagine the water as these hydrogens constantly jumping around from ion to ion, giving us this kind of... So you imagine that there are zillions and zillions of these jumping ships to make ions going on in water. So water looks like this really calm substance, but in there it is mad. It's a frenzy. And you can see this poor little blue blob in the middle is being surrounded by these crazy water molecules. And we'll see why this is important in a minute. So, if we take Mordanting, we're using a metal salt like alum to form a bridge between the dye stuff and the fibre. Okay. Alum's really easily available. You can order it online. It's used as a food preservative and a flocculant, so it's relatively benign. And its full title is potassium aluminium sulfate, but we're interested in this ion here. Okay, so remember our crazy water molecules that are ionizing like mad? What they start to do is that the negative end of the polar water molecule is attracted to the aluminium ion from the lattice, the metal lattice, or the metal salt lattice that we had before, this stuff. Okay. And what it does is it separates out that aluminium ion from the sulfate ion. So it breaks up this lattice. Okay. So now these aluminium ions are going round in the water. That was the little blue thing. Going round in the water. They've got a charge of +3, which gives them some pulling power, quite strong. So now we've got our wool. Okay. The wool structure is a long chain structure. It's got these functional groups on the side. The functional groups are negatively charged. And they, once we add some alumine, the aluminium ions, which are positively charged from our mordant, are then attracted to these negative functional groups on the wool. So now we've got our aluminium ions, our mordant, attached to our wool. Okay, so we're finally ready to dye. Okay, phew. I told you it's a long process. It's a labour of love. It really is. So some dyers do like to add their dye stuffs straight into the pot with the wool. I don't, because you'll pick it all out again. So you would make a dye liquor first. So you would add in your dye stuffs. You don't have to use heat for this, but if you don't use heat, you need to give it a long time. I prefer to do, it's called a cold mordanting or cold dyeing method. Okay, from this book, which I'm going to recommend if you're taking this any further, which has recipes in it. And basically what you're doing to mordant and dye is to give initial heat over an hour, very gradual initial heat over an hour, then turn it off and leave it and go away for at least 24 hours. I leave stuff in dye pots for ages. And that will give the mordant or the dye plenty of time to adhere. With mordanting, you don't want to be putting loads and loads of mordant in. So you're looking probably about 7 or 8% weight of fibre for your alum mordant. Because if you put lots and lots of alum in, you will tend to get sticky yarns. You're also wasting it, and you've also got to dispose of it as well. So what we're looking at, I suppose a lot of people they've done PhDs past and present on mordants and how much alum, and there's somebody's writing up at the moment about it, so she's looking at optimum amounts to use. But you will also see some dyes using enormous amounts, so I prefer to hover around the 10 mark and not have too much alum in my pot. Okay, so let's see. So we talked about muslin bags. If you're going for extracts, remember that every dye stuff is different. You've got to treat it like a child, that they're all going to react differently. So for extracts, you'll need differing amounts. There's no point in adding too much alum or too much dye stuffs because there's only a certain number of those sites, those charged functional groups that they can stick to. So there's no point in having lots and lots. If you've got fresh dye stuffs, I would go for 200% weight of fibre plus. A lot of people say 100%, but I think you get very I don't like wishy-washy colours, so I quite like a bit of punch. If they're dried, bit like if you were using dried herbs, I'd go sort of 75% to 100%. And then, so we have got our wool, plus our mordant, plus a bit of Himalayan rhubarb that we're dyeing with. Okay, so now we've got our long chain amino acid, our negative functional groups, our mordant in solution that's attached to it, because unlike charges like each other. And then we've got our Himalayan rhubarb, which also has these side groups, which are also charged negatively, which go, ha, I found myself some lovely positive aluminium ions in this solution, so I'm going to stick to them. So now we've got our mordant literally biting into our wool and into our dye stuff, and it's holding it on there. Okay, right. So a lot of people ask about light fastness. There are dyes that are better. So you've got the Grand Taint dyes that have been traditionally used that have really good light and wash fastness. It doesn't mean that you can't use, like I really like using, I don't know, Brazil wood and logwood, but they're not necessarily known for their light fastness, but you can do things like you could mix your Brazil wood in with your madder, or with your logwood you could use some post-mordanting techniques to get yourself some browns and navies and things that are more light fast. But it's this part of the electromagnetic spectrum, the UV from the sun and the high frequency visible light, that will destroy the bonds. They'll destroy the conjugation in the bonds. Do you remember the alternating single and double bonds? So that's what's happening if you leave something out in the sun or in a window. Okay, so once you've made all this effort to naturally dye your things, you need to keep them out of the light, really. They're not a whole lot worse than synthetics, but they do need to be taken care of. And once you've got some samples, if you've been experimenting, you can put some tin foil over the sides of those, put them in a window, and then do your own little light tests and see how well they're functioning. Okay. Wash fastness, I think just really take care of your woolens like you would anyway. So as well as the Grand Taint dyes, things like walnut and goldenrod, really good wash fastness. So you look at low temperature, the dye bonds won't cope with high temperature and you'll lose your colour. Gentle hand wash, detergent again, spot clean them, this obsession with cleaning everything, spot clean and then maybe wash after winter and store carefully. Okay. So last little bit, you've done brilliantly, thank you. So with natural dyeing, the energy problems come usually with the water. But the dye stuffs themselves are extremely expensive because anyone who's tried to grow dye plants knows that the energy expenditure plus the actual cost of everything. If you're buying them, they will be expensive because a lot of work has gone into them. So you can, every time you've got a pot of dye, let me find them. So if you've got a pot of dye, so this is dyed with fustic, which is dyer's mulberry, and I start off with this colour, and then there'll be still quite a lot of dye stuff in the solution. Do a first exhaust, second exhaust, third exhaust, so that you're not wasting any of your dye stuffs. Even when I'm left with like quite an insipid colour, I'll use it in with something else, and then it will slightly nudge the colour, and you can get quite experimental with it. Some dyers who I've talked to use what we call a closed system, and they must have a lot of pots, but they will have one pot that is totally like their madder pot, and they will just keep that pot going in rotation. One method that I really like, I don't know why I'm talking about madder so much today, but I suppose it's a common one. Say I've done a madder bath, so I've got my bricky red or whatever out of it. I've done my second exhaust to get there's an orange one missing, but then the coral and then the peach. So you've gone through all these, you've got to have lots of mordanted wool available. But then I've got something that I don't really like the look of now. So I'm going to bung the rest of the madder back in, and I'm going to heat it quite strongly to get a brown, because that'll access remember we said that they have different phytochemicals, these plants. So access the brown, then you get this sort of brown out, don't really like that. So then I'd over dye with indigo and you get some lovely teals. So you just keep that pot going, that continuous dye pot, and it's so much fun. That's like the best bit. You can see that jumper in the front, can't you? The Venus sweater in the front. So I'm thinking, right, what do I want that to look like? So I know that I can do a fustic dye pot, an exhaust dye pot, and then I can split the wool quantities up, and then I can do a little brief iron bath afterwards to get those greens. And so I've used all of that dye stuff in that dye pot, but I've got 4 different colours. So that's the way I'd encourage you to go. And I haven't got any horrible colours yet, I don't think. If you have grown a load of dye plants, dehydrate them, store them, make sure they're in a dry place. You've got a paper bag so that they don't go mouldy. But I have got amazing colours from mouldy flowers before, so, you know, do what I say, not what I do. And right, it's a really water heavy process. This is the one that everybody trots out when they talk about natural dyeing being not so good. So if you have got a garden, you need loads of these around. So I used to use all my rainwater. Plymouth does nothing but rain. This, hands down, is the most useful thing that I have bought. It's amazing. So your humble spin dryer, dyeing is hard work. It's really physical. It's hard on the hands, and rinsing. So you literally imagine your soapy wool straight in, rinse it out. Then it's easy to rinse the rest of the soap out in the sink. Mordanting, same thing. Dump your wet mordanted skeins in. Get that mordanted water out, back in the dye pot so you're not wasting your water or your alum if there's more in there. Same with the dyes, so straight in, and then any spare dye stuff that's been whizzed out, back in your pot. So it's not going down the sink. And then you'll have to do a lot less rinsing, and you'll use a lot less water. If you haven't got space for that, or you're just doing little samples, salad spinner. And the other one that I really like, and this works well with some red-based dye stuffs, is to cure them like you would meat or fish. So once they're dyed and they've been spun, hang them up, leave them, go away, leave them, and then maybe a couple of weeks later, give them a rinse. And I find that you get less dye, so I guess the dye particles have had more chance to bond. And saving heat energy, all I've got in my notes here is time. So if you're going to solar dye, I know you really want to see what's in the jar or whatever, but leave them for weeks, months in the sun so that they can the yarn can properly absorb the dye stuff. You do need heat, and you can't get heat. You're not getting heat for free. You're not getting it from here, so you've got to give it time to for the dye stuffs to adhere to the wool. Okay, right, resources. I've given you a list. Okay, so I'm not going to read through the list, but bear in mind your guild people will be incredibly helpful. If you're a beginner and you haven't invested and you're for the UK-based people, really, really good book. Jenny Dean's Wild Colour. If you want to take it a bit further and you want to try some recipes, and especially if you want to dye onto cellulose fibres, remember I said a bit trickier, it's got a tannin stage in it as well, because they cellulose fibres just don't have those sites for the mordant to attach to, so you need another step in. But these two have provided really amazing resource in that book. And if you're a glutton for punishment, I haven't scratched the surface yet. Dominique Cardon, amazing book. She's just won the Turner Medal. Incredible book. I mean, it mind boggles really. So that's everything you wanted to know about natural dyes and the history. So her name is it's on your list, yeah, Dominique Cardon. Really good. Historical dye recipes, you'll hear people talk about Liles. And then this one, this is by the university in Helsinki, is doing a lot of work on natural dyes. So this one's got a bit of chemistry in it as well at the back, which is useful if you're interested in that. Okay. Workshops, look out for natural dye workshops. I'm doing, yes, I wanted to say, I do my courses with Myra online, and they're based in Canada, but they've got some free resource videos as well on their website that are really good to get you going. And there's nothing like seeing somebody else do it as well. So you think, oh, right, that's a good technique. Okay. Your local universities, a lot of the arts colleges are well into renewables and looking at ways to save energy. So you will find lots of resources there. Support your local growers, so your local plant growers. Ditchling is just one of the famous dye course museums. And then we've got, what have we got there? Plants and Colour I've done some courses with in this country. So they tend to be online courses, watching other dyers do things. But these are all, good, solid, evidence-based courses. And also, if you're interested in the future of natural dyes, there's things like the BioDyes conferences that are on YouTube. Okay, now the fun bit. Once you've got your head around all that, you can really start to curate some colours and to get some collections together. So these are my sort of preferred shades of mohair onto mohair silk, where you can get a colour going onto the core of the silk, and then you can over dye, and you'll get that initial colour gleaming through your over dyed colour. I just love it. This is my Shetland collection that I designed primarily for colour work, so you can see that you've got sort of gradations in the colours, but you've also got good contrast as well. So your head starts going about what you can make, and then you start spotting things, and you think, oh, I'd like to make a collection that's based on these pebbles that I've seen. So you end up making this sort of thing. And I know that that was my lavender cotton from my last garden, over dyed with indigo. That was a new method that I tried with an acid tannin method with cochineal. And this one was, what was this one? So this was playing around with different types of tannins and modifying them and pinching some methods from the acid dyeing world. And just really just trying to experiment and picture where you're going with these. And I just want to say the colours are anything but dull. If you do this properly, don't be tempted. Everybody's favourite thing. Don't be tempted to bung loads and loads and loads of wool into 100 grams of coreopsis or something, because you will get disappointing colour. So just think about your quantities, I suppose. And then you start seeing things out in the wild, and people have actually bought your wool and they have made things and they are wearing the things, and it's incredible. So people come and see you at festivals, they go, look at this. Yeah, let me take a picture of it. So that's brilliant. The other thing, really close to my heart, is this has been a bit of a new start for me, and it's meant that I've made friends and connections that I would never have had, like working with John Arbon, like working with my friend to produce inks for her to illustrate cards with. So that's the eucalyptus drawn with eucalyptus ink. We've got, I work with Ellis, and she's just redesigned one of her bunty mitt patterns, so I've put some kits together for that for today. So we love trying to figure out, what would be suitable, what yarn, what colours. I've met so many amazing sheep farmers, stall holders, people who are passionate about unprocessed wool and where we can take it, and I've bartered weeding time to go off with somebody's goldenrod. There's all sorts of lovely little connections going on. I've got to know some amazing people. Okay, so thank you so much for listening. Enjoy your dyeing. Be safe, please, with your dyeing, and keep learning. Thank you.